economy, security, and internal stability. I'll once again welcome on stage Mr. Riz Khan, who's the moderator for this session.
हमारा आधी आबादी गुर्बत की लकीर या उससे नीचे, हम इसको ऊपर नहीं उठा सकते.
A crumbling economy, a challenging global image,
working productively with Pakistan to confront terrorists who operate on its soil.
big promises, but perhaps misplaced priority.
प्लीज हमें जल्द से जल्द यहाँ से रेस्क्यू किया जाए.
पाकिस्तान गवर्नमेंट किस चीज का वेट कर रही है?
Pakistan has big diplomatic goals, wanting to strike a balance between China and the United States, but it needs to address problems at home. Islamabad has to address issues such as those in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Pakistan takes pride in its Muslim identity and needs to speak out on the plight of the Uyghur Muslims.
What's your stance on China's treatment of Uyghur Muslims?
Frankly, I don't know much about that.
In selling the narrative of peace, the government of Prime Minister Imran Khan has to tackle homegrown terror and take steps towards making the neighborhood safe. What steps can Pakistan take to show the right policy and diplomacy? Session 3. Balancing and recalibrating Pakistan's diplomatic strategy, economy, security, and political stability. The dialogue partners for this session are Khurshid Mahmood Kasuri, former Foreign Minister of Pakistan; Salman Bashir, former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan; Reham Khan, journalist, commentator, and broadcaster.
I thought I was still wired up. Please, a round of applause for our panelists here. So I hope you had a good lunch. Now, of course, earlier we were discussing India's challenges and position on the geopolitical stage. And of course, how can we have a broader discussion about South Asia unless we look at the situation for Pakistan too? So I'm very honored to have our distinguished panel join us here. Diplomacy is a difficult language. You know, I had this experience with Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa. He was on my show a few years ago, and I bumped into him at the United Nations in an elevator with his family. And I said, you know, Archbishop Tutu, you said one of the most diplomatic things I've ever heard. He said to me, what was that? Now, he was with his family, so I didn't impersonate him to himself. But he said on my show, thank God I am not God. Otherwise, I would have to say Osama bin Laden and George Bush are both my children. I said, that was very diplomatic, Archbishop Tutu. And he laughed. He said, yes, I wanted to make a point. I said, but you're not that diplomatic, apparently, when an interviewer discovered during the interview, when he was about to interview you, that it was your 50th wedding anniversary. And this journalist said, Archbishop Tutu, you've been married 50 years. That's a long time. In all those 50 years, have you ever contemplated divorce? And Archbishop Tutu said, divorce? Never. But murder? So diplomacy even slips away from those we admire as being diplomatic. So I know this is going to be a fiery session, and I think that's expected from our guests too. Very honored to have them up here. And of course, you know, you're in a difficult position because a lot of the things that are being discussed are the challenges that Pakistan is facing, and some of those were raised on the video prior to. So perhaps the former Foreign Minister of Pakistan, Khurshid Mahmood Kasuri, I'll start with you, sir, and ask you, what do you see to be the biggest challenge that Pakistan faces right now?
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers of the event.
You have to hold it a bit closer, that's all.
Is it all right?
Yeah, it's all right. You just have to hold it closer, yeah.
For inviting us here. But I'd like to break away, if I may, from some of the questions that you have in mind. And this is because I heard the speeches of my distinguished friends from India this morning. And unless I take note of that, you see, we all seem to live in an echo chamber. We only hear each other. if this conference was being held in Islamabad, and if there were international guests, not just Indian Pakistanis, they'd be saying things that are completely different. And that's why I compliment the organizers of the conference. It's a huge challenge. We think differently. In fact, in most of the things that were said here, I think in exactly the opposite manner. Exactly the opposite. It's not that there are differences, but that doesn't resolve. That's the whole issue. When you have differences of this nature, that is when diplomacy comes in. I have not given up hope. Why? I think it was Dean Ageism who wrote a book, Present at Creation. Because he was present when the new structure after the Second World War was being created. I was present when we came almost to resolving the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. And when I say that, no Indian who have ever been in a position to contradict me has done so. In fact, in recent years, the former Foreign Secretary, the former National Security Advisor, Shiv Shankar Menon, and probably last year, the back channel negotiator, Mr. Lamba, was asked a straight question by an Indian magazine. It was 2 years ago. I've got all the dates and all. If somebody wants, I'll give them after this. Kasuri Saab keeps on saying that they were near a resolution of Jammu and Kashmir. He says, I think he's right. He said it without a pause. And Shiv Shankar Menon, and they've all said the same thing. So, having stated that we live in our echo chambers, that we think differently, we have no options, as Vajpayee said. Prime Minister Vajpayee was a wise man. He said, you can change your friends, but not your neighbors. We are condemned to live with each other. How shall we live? That is the challenge.
But that's not the best perspective. We're condemned to live with each other. I think maybe you could be more diplomatic there.
Because there's so much of negativity in South Asia.
Understood.
That's why I used the word.
Just a quick follow-up then. Why do you think things have drifted so far now? If you were so close at one stage, why have things drifted so far?
Why have?
Things drifted so far apart now.
That is a very unfortunate thing. In August 2006, we received a message from former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. When you go to Delhi, or most of them will go back to Delhi, they can ask Prime Minister Manmohan Singh what I'm telling you now. When I went to see him, he had lots of books, but the most prominent book on his table was mine. I was quite pleased, because he said to some Indian, "Inhone to sab sach likh diya." They didn't expect Foreign Minister of Pakistan to be speaking the entire truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So he put the book, and he actually, you ask him, in 2006 August, we had invited him to Islamabad to come and sign the agreement on Sir Creek, and 90% of the issue on Jammu and Kashmir has been resolved. The idea was that since people continue to say that Pakistan and India cannot resolve each other bilaterally, you have to bring in either the World Bank on Indus Basin, or to bring in a tribunal in the run of Kutch. We wanted to prove that they were wrong. We could do things bilaterally. That was a challenge. Okay. So he was going to come in August 2006. Then he said, as usual, India is a huge country, there are some election or the other, 6 elections including those of UP were being held. He said, could you postpone the date? Our misfortune was that we said to him, okay, March. I wish we had said to him November, December, January. March is when President Musharraf decided to take on the Chief Justice of Pakistan, and all hell let loose. Okay. Otherwise, the issue was very near a resolution.
All right, so I'm going to come back to you on that in a minute. I'm going to bring in Raham Khan here as well. You know Pakistani politics from the inside. Every country has messy politics. Literally, every country has it. What would you say is particularly unusual about Pakistan's politics from your perspective?
I think quite the obvious that we've had a very checkered history when it comes to democracy. And I think that across the world now, I see with a lot of pain and a lot of anguish that actually the democratic voice is completely lost. So it's not only true for Pakistan now, we've seen that across the world. We see a very dictatorial approach, be it in the US or the UK But particularly for our neighbors, I see all the happenings in Delhi recently with the Citizenship Amendment Act, the lynching in broad daylight of Muslim citizens of Delhi, the Article 370 abrogation of that without taking the Indian Parliament into confidence. So you see, the challenges that Pakistan has faced for the last over 72 years, I fear that those concerns, I have similar concerns about India now. And why we're concerned is because when you suppress the democratic voice, when you suppress dissenting voices, when there is fascism, you are bound to create more chaos and instability in the region. So I think what was unusual about Pakistan is not unusual anymore, because we see the pattern being repeated in India, we see the pattern being repeated in other countries, and I think that there has to be a space created for moderate, sensible voices who disregard jingoism, who disregard democracy and democratic values. So I think that's what's unusual about Pakistan. But in recent times, I think where there has been an increase of, shall we say, dictatorship in Pakistan or a sham democracy, we've also seen the rise of sensible voices. I think that we have to give credit to Pakistani voices, particularly those in the opposition and those in civil society, for actually showing a lot of sensibility. And I must also point out, because our military, of course, gets a lot of flack, but I think that in recent times, post-Pulwama, post the attack in Balakot, post-Kashmir, even the Citizenship Amendment Act, I think that one must, and I'm not a fan of the government at the moment in Pakistan, but I would say that the military has shown restraint. I think that if there has been a positive step made towards peace and perhaps a milder approach that has been shown by Pakistan, it must be appreciated.
Okay. Salman Bashir, sir, you're the former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan. Do you feel, listening to what has already been said, that things have drifted far apart, that we've lost a time where there were sensible voices, as Reham has indicated?
Well, I think definitely. I think we have lost a lot of time, actually, plus 70 years. Having said that, and having seen the situation, and I believe everybody knows where we are, things have regressed very steeply, very deeply, and the misunderstandings have been blown, to a certain extent. But having said that, as Foreign Minister Kasuri Saab said, he personally invested a lot in peace, in the efforts towards peace. I think, speaking of Pakistan, of the Parliament of Pakistan, of the governments, the present and the past, and having worked and interacted with the parliaments and the political system in Pakistan, I can say with a lot of confidence that we have always been very keen to have good neighborly relations with India. Now, the question basically is, how do you start in the present situation? And I think what is glaringly absent at this point in time, at least that is how we see it from Islamabad's perspective, is the political will in Delhi. Because somehow the Pakistan factor has been very much a part of domestic politics. We have seen that run up to the re-election of the present government, and it is being sort of perpetuated, as Reham said, internally in terms of the actions that the BJP government has taken. It has certain popular appeal, courtesy of the media. So I think it is time for the countries of South Asia, and especially India, now to, break this pattern. You cannot be a great power leading power in the world if you have running problems with your smaller neighbors. So it is time, I think, to sort of, take a break and see what can be done.
And I'll come round back to that, but I'll bring in Mr. Kasuri again. Has Pakistan lost a friend in America? President Trump seems very cozy now with Prime Minister Modi.
Yes, I think the relationship with the United States had taken a nosedive in 2011. And that is the measure that I use to judge how much improvement there has been. They killed our soldiers, aerial bombing. They said it was a mistake. We stopped their route for 6 months. We said that will not be opened unless you apologize. Then Secretary Clinton apologized and it was opened. Raymond Davis, an American CIA agent, was arrested. He was sent to prison and the relation took a further nosedive. So many things happened in 2011 that can be called the most horrible year in our relation. Now look at the situation. I think President Trump has said about 8 or 10 times that he's prepared to facilitate, to be whatever, between Pakistan and India, to act as not an arbitrator, to mediate between Pakistan and India, despite the fact that he knows that India will not accept mediation. He continues to say that. There must be some method to that madness. He's not known to be mad. He may be known to be reckless, but he's not known to be mad.
Do you believe he would be a fair mediator?
Sorry?
Do you believe President Trump would be a fair mediator either way?
Well, let me put it like this. There are only 2 countries really who can play any role. Only 2 countries. China, India will not accept. China, I say, because it's our common neighbor. United States, despite the fact that there's a definite tilt towards India, it's a strategic partner. In fact, they continue to repeat it every day that they are strategic partners. And this morning we heard the General Secretary of the BJP repeat that they are strategic partners. Despite that, as 2-3 years ago, a book was written in which precisely this issue was taken, that United States and Pakistan were embroiled in an embrace that they could not escape. It said no exit from Pakistan. And I've forgotten the name, the author will come back. Now the point is, why? And he goes on to mention 3 or 4 reasons. Pakistan's own size, maybe smaller than India's, but it's one of the 5 or 6 countries in the world. Pakistan army, one of the 5 or 6 important armies in the world. The only Muslim nuclear power. Then Pakistan's relationship with China and India. 2 countries which feature very importantly on United States diplomatic radar. So I feel and then with the role we played in Afghanistan, President Trump and everybody has been praising that role. So there is no reason for me to believe that the situation in the United States is much improved.
Okay. Reham, let's get your perspective on this, please.
I respectfully disagree with that. I think the minute that I saw Trump sit across the Prime Minister of Pakistan and say that he wanted to be a mediator in an issue which I think that was the beginning of where it all went wrong. I think that if anybody can mediate, it would have to be China, purely because if you look at the past track record, we've not seen every single time, and this is on record, every single time that India and Pakistan have had any issue on territorial disputes or Kashmir, China has stayed neutral. Even though we regard China in Pakistan as all-weather friend, but they have shown restraint throughout our history, where China has not become involved in India and Pakistan disputes, particularly recently, last year we saw as well. I also fear that Pakistan for a very long time has been blamed for extremism, and we've been called all sorts of things like the epicenter of terrorism, and we've had this crackdown on militant organizations, and we've had a lot of demands being put on us by America to say, even going as far as do more, whereas I think people forget that the beginning of all of this militant organizations and all of this jihadi element was planted by the US in Pakistan. So I feel that's quite hypocritical of them to suggest. But what I fear now is that although we have been given an image of being the epicenter of terrorism and militant and extremist views, but I see that being mimicked in India. And I feel that the US is not only turning a blind eye, possibly even encouraging this militancy and extremism. So if Islamic extremism was wrong, how can you say that Hindu extremism is correct? It cannot be correct. And I fear that that is the pattern of behavior in India now. And we don't want India, in all fairness. I'm not a government spokesperson and I'm not here to defend the government or the military, but I do think that India must be very cautious about going down the route of extremism, because Pakistan has suffered. And we would not want further instability and chaos with one new brand of extremism from India in the region.
Raham, thank you. So I'm going to expand on this idea, though, also with Mr. Bashir, and ask, to what degree have the economics of the global stage changed to the degree where the politics are being pushed aside by economic considerations? Mr. Trump has a lot to gain economically, of course. China's in a totally different place from, say, 20 years ago. How much are economics dominating the way the politics are shifting?
Well, I think, we thought that economics was a big factor. India is a big market, so of course India has a certain appeal for people, all over the world, which we recognize and which is not necessarily a bad thing, actually. Pakistan itself is a market of about 200 million plus. So yes, economics should be the uppermost factor in politics. But unfortunately, following what has been said, I think if you take a view, 30,000 feet view of the situation in South Asia, I think we have the proclivity now to fall victim to geopolitics. The American position, globally speaking, and more specifically in our part of the world, as they say, the concept of the Indo-Pacific, but as applied to South Asia and Afghanistan, I think it is from the geopolitical prism, that is the China factor, that the US is viewing this region. They have not been sensitive to the differences or the possibilities and the opportunities within that region. I've said to my American friends that you ought to at least come up with some sort of a vision statement that you have for South Asia. Also in the larger context of Indo-Pacific. But unfortunately, I think the states of South Asia, who were all members of SAARC, they have lost their own ability and the capacity to put together such a vision for the future. I think that's where one should be focused on, at least at the leadership level, to see what we really want. And the fact is that, there are troubles everywhere globally. What has happened is that the political systems and the economic systems have become sort of dysfunctional. And that applies also to our part of the world. So there are ongoing challenges, and those challenges basically are arising from societal changes and challenges which are being propelled again by globalization, technology, and demography, basically.
Mr. Kasuri, we've seen progress sometimes in the past. There's been cricket diplomacy, there's been openness in some areas. There's a lot of cultural integrity often with sharing of, music and art and stuff. What do you see as are the positive areas that the two countries could look at in order to try to at least start to build bridges, even if the politics are quite far apart?
I was so hard-pressed when I was coming here to find some areas, considering the current state of relations, that I was reminded that when Napoleon Bonaparte defeated Emperor Francis II, Austria-Hungary, the best way to bridge the trust deficit was to arrange a marriage between the emperor's daughter, Marie-Louise, and Napoleon Bonaparte. So I started looking around, were there any Were there any possible bachelors or women?
I don't know if marriage diplomacy has ever been on the cards.
Only two. Rahul Gandhi in India, Bilawal Bhutto in Pakistan. Now Rahul, I've even found a match because he's been, probably not very successful so far. And I thought a Rajput chieftain's daughter in Umarkot, in Tharparkar, where Akbar was born, that might be the right place. So we could look, that may be one. Because if you want to cut corners, you'll have to try harder for Bilawal Bhutto. Now, on a more serious note, on a more serious note, I would suggest take baby steps, because I've been through it all. The current state of relations is so pathetic. Is the only word. It may be an undiplomatic word. The sort of language that is being used by Delhi and Islamabad about each other, I've never heard it before. That tells you the state of our relations. So those are the baby steps. So let's go for baby steps. We've been through composite dialogue. We've been through comprehensive dialogue. We have no options, by the way, to come without a dialogue, because there's no way you can resolve. So the baby steps are as follows. Number one, there's going to be a Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Delhi. Pakistan will be invited because it's a member. I doubt very strongly that Prime Minister Imran Khan will go. It will be a big political risk. But if India were to create a more congenial atmosphere, maybe Pakistan will not boycott and send its foreign minister. So baby step would be to see that something is done, the situation doesn't deteriorate further, and at the foreign ministers' conference, what is the other baby step? The most non-controversial is religious tourism. You saw how popular Kartarpur corridor was. When I was foreign minister, I invited Mr. Advani to perform we had restored Katas Raj temple in near Islamabad, and it's about 50 minutes drive from Islamabad. And then there is the very famous temple in Balochistan. And then, of course, the Muslims could be allowed to visit shrines, Hazrat Imamuddin Awliya and Ajmer Sharif. Now, this is not controversial. So, if you were to allow these baby steps, allow group religious tourism, that may perhaps, given the state of current bad relations, be then a very important step. You continue to ask me, why was President Trump? Can he play? I said, why does he repeat? You see, what happens is, he repeats to please Pakistanis, but it also displeases the Indians. So we are very happy that he repeats it, because we want something to be done about Kashmir, and I'd be happy if he repeats it 10 times more. But perhaps what would make more impression on India is either Trump or the British leadership or Europeans like Chancellor Merkel or President Macron were to also play a role behind the scenes. How do I know? The first call that I received was from Colin Powell. He said to me, Khurshid, you'll soon hear good news, be prepared to receive it. I said, what will happen? Next day, Mr. Vajpayee extended his famous hand of friendship to Pakistan, and we were ready. We immediately invited him to Pakistan. So a major world power should play a role behind the scenes. Fourth baby step, businessmen. Forget the commerce secretaries, they're not going to meet because the governments are not talking. But why is the government of India refusing visas to private businessmen? I don't understand. We give visas. So I think these are the baby steps.
Okay. Thanks. I was intrigued by your marriage diplomacy and then your use of baby steps afterwards. I think that's almost guaranteed.
I quite like Kasuri Saab's idea. I think he's suggesting a modern version of Veer Zara, and I believe Modi ji is single. So that's certainly a possibility. But yes, the baby steps did unnerve me as well. I was thinking of some cross-border IVF here. But I think I agree with the baby steps idea. I agree with the proposal idea also. But I think that baby steps, even even further down, say not even the foreign minister. I think one of the biggest mistakes we've done with vis-a-vis India-Pakistan relationship has been that it's always been very high profile. So I think it doesn't have to be at a prime ministerial level. It doesn't even have to be at the foreign ministry level. I do not agree with cosmetic steps like music and films and art. And I think I also believe that artists of either side should not be dragged into the politics. I think it's unfair to them.
But do they have to be dragged into politics? They could just simply sharing.
I don't think that they should be used as mouthpieces, is what I meant, to be more specific. I think art should not be involved in this. This is far serious business, and I think that the baby steps would include maybe not only business to business, but I think at a lower level connection on trade and commerce. And I think that what America is doing now is, we've seen in the last couple of months, it's replaced China and has become the biggest trading partner with India now. And I think the US is using that economic route. It is natural for us to use the economic route, because although all roads might go to China, but all roads go via Pakistan. So I think that we need to understand the strategic importance of Pakistan as a transit country, and I think that it makes more sense to be building trade relationships, genuine trade relationships between Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, and China, than to be sort of, building relationships with the US. I think that's where I see that with a lot of concern.
Riham, a quick follow-up on this. As someone who lives in London, I grew up in London. I was born in Yemen, grew up in London, have family on both sides of the border. I consider myself a Ukasian. And I grew up with Indians, Pakistanis, everyone. And we never considered religion or background. We considered ourselves united. What role can expats play in trying to bridge the gap?
I was born in Libya, and I was raised in Peshawar during the Afghan war, and then in the UK for much of my life. I've just recently been living near London, and I think that the role of the expats has been, I speak as a former overseas Pakistani, unfamiliar with Pakistani politics, and I do think that expats, particularly those from a Pakistani origin, are detached, so they don't really know what's going on the ground. And one of the reasons where I wrote the book as well was because I felt it was important to educate people to know what is the realities, to sift between the propaganda and what the reality of politics is in Pakistan. So we were sold, obviously, the propaganda theory of what's good in Pakistan and what's not. Expats, I think particularly now, can play a very active role. With the Citizenship Amendment Act, we've had a lot of pressure on our Pakistani origin politicians, and we've seen the MP for Peribar, Khalid Mahmood, who's the first Muslim parliamentarian, also raise this issue in Parliament, and the UK Parliament condemning the Citizenship Amendment Act, and also the passive role of the police with the rioting in Delhi. And I think that's a positive role. I think we need to move away from propaganda, and we need to move towards building relationships. Like you said, we live in the UK, and we have very good relationships with our Sikh brethren. I've been very closely associated with my work for several years. I'm very fond of the Smethik Gurdwara and the food there, and I've just been offered a visit to the Gurdwara in Dubai as well, with the Hindus as well. And I do not understand why we can live in perfect harmony, attend each other's weddings, have no problem with our faith or our belief system in the UK. It was the same in Libya. I grew up around people from different nationalities and different faiths. Why do we have to do that? Because the politics at home drags us into it, and we watch, I fear that Indians watch only Indian television channels. There's a lot of jingoism there at the moment, and Pakistanis only watch the Pakistani channels. And right now, it's not a great idea to be watching Pakistani channels because there's not much you can say which is based on honesty. So I think that expats need to perhaps even travel, but also not be blinded by propaganda. We need to rebuild. The way forward for Pakistan and India is economic. We have an emerging economic power in the shape of India, and we talk about Pakistani economy crumbling in the last 16, 17 months, but look at India. Pre-Article 370, One of the biggest successes was the revenue, the GDP in Kashmir, in India. But what did we see? We see that plummeting. We see a decline in car manufacturing in Pakistan. We see a decline in car manufacturing in India. So certainly the way out is economic, and we must collaborate on that.
I want to get Salman Bashir's view on the idea of the baby steps that Kasuri Saab was mentioning, about especially the idea that businesses can work closer together.
Yes, Riz, I think that's also what Riham has said. Trade, businesses, economic cooperation, certainly. In fact, one of the things that I often boast about is when I was High Commissioner to India, we nearly got the trade normalization done. It's another thing, it's not actually been translated into the implementation side. Baby steps, yes. But I think, to give you my honest view, nothing is going to work. No dialogue, no back channel, unless the Indian government takes steps to ease the situation in Jammu and Kashmir. That is absolutely the bottom line. Kasuri Saab mentioned the possibility of the Foreign Minister of Pakistan attending the SCO in Delhi. Well, certainly, but I think bilaterally, there is not any scope left for Pakistan, even in diplomatic terms, unless the situation in Jammu and Kashmir, the repression is eased. I think that's the, but fine. But having said that, the situation as it is a problem at the moment, more, of course, for the Kashmiris and for India. But having said all this, let me just go back to something on the positive side. You know, these 70 years, we have reached understandings and agreements which are quite substantive. So if there is the political will, all of this can be brought forward, which means not only tourism of the type that was mentioned by Kasuri Saab, but also we have a visa liberalization agreement that was signed 2013. It's not been implemented. There is the whole area of humanitarian aspects, concerning especially those in prison in both countries. There are agreed recommendations of the Judiciary Committee, which can just be picked up and implemented. So if you ease travels, then, of course, most important, the 2003 understanding on respect for the ceasefire on the line of control. We need to have some sort of, sanity prevail and restore respect for the ceasefire. And that will be a very positive step on which other things could be built. And then leading, of course, to a bigger step, that is trade normalization. I think that is also, that was agreed. And then we deal with the differences and the disputes. Mm-hmm. And it can be done if there is this political will, if it's demonstrated tangibly.
So, Mr. Kasuri, one thing we've seen at a global level is the breaking down of institutions, in the sense that the pacts that formed the various organizations seem to be building walls within, and there's more nationalization, more populism taking place. How much does that harm the situation in South Asia, in your opinion?
Thank you. I'll answer. But I'm grateful to the former Foreign Secretary for clarifying one thing which I had stated. I had said that I hope India would take steps to enable Pakistani participation, admittedly at a lower level. And that is what I had in mind, that something should be done to ease the pain of the Kashmiris. Because otherwise it will not be possible, although Pakistan would like to attend Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Coming to the the situation of various, let's start with SARC. Now, I was a great believer in SARC. And I'll tell you one thing which most people had not noticed, which I had. And that was the sheer volume of meetings, sheer volume of meetings between India and Pakistan, between the countries of SAARC, various officials from SAARC countries. I had once calculated that in 1 year it was more than 200. Now, this creates a new dynamic. Forget the progress that's being made in every area. We are humans. It makes a lot of difference, the personal touch. That, and furthermore, it never ceases to amaze me. India is the biggest power in South Asia. Pakistan is probably the second biggest power. Now, we are not prepared to meet each other in SAARC, but we will meet each other in SCO, where Russia and China are calling the shots. That's again very amazing. In an area where we can set the terms, we are not prepared to meet. We will meet. We are even prepared to take part in military operations under the auspices of SAARC, which Pakistani and Indian troops have done. So, yes, it's creating a problem as far as connectivity is concerned. My dream, as a Pakistani, Pakistan's strategic situation, the great dream when I was foreign minister was connectivity. India, as foreign minister, prime minister, in fact, Manmohan Singh said, lunch somewhere, breakfast somewhere, lunch somewhere, dinner somewhere. I would actually say that I had in mind that the connectivity should be India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, China, and through CPAC, to which India now objects, the whole of this region can be actually connected. Without connectivity, European Union, you see, these days, name of the game is connectivity. If you do not have connectivity, so I think you hit the nail on the head, that if you're going to destroy connectivity, you're actually going to keep yourself backwards. Now, isn't it amazing that China has become the chief spokesman of globalization? They've understood the advantage of a huge market. And I think we should learn from that. And it's really, I was so sad. It was so, and I was unhappy to read the World Bank report, which said that we have a pathetic trade between Pakistan and India. They said the potential currently is $47 billion between the two countries. So first I got a shock. Then I said, why, what's so surprising? It was one market. It was all one market, and we traded with each other. So 47 billion is the figure the World Bank worked out.
So, Rehan, one of the things that has occurred in more than 70 years of tensions and disruption and conflict is that there must be younger generations becoming quite disillusioned with politics. Well, I think we are discussing that. But... So, okay, so...
Let me...
No, so this...
I can link Please. To that, and I'm glad that you've pointed it out. But I think that, as many would realize, that part of a good interview or discussion is not to be only asking questions, but to be leading from the answers, and it is a developing discussion. So I think that that's what Riz is trying to do. But in response to what Kasuri Saab has said, actually even going further, you see, resetting Pakistan's or recalibration is very difficult. Again, I'm not a spokesperson for the Pakistani government or the military, but you cannot imagine the sort of pressure Pakistani government, the foreign ministry, the foreign office has when Kashmir is raised, wherever it's raised. Hear me out. So we have seen in the past.
Ladies and gents, please show some respect. Please show some respect and let the conversation continue.
In several years, we have seen the previous governments, particularly Mia Mohammad Nawaz Sharif, being labelled things like Modi ka yaar, because every single time there has been political will in Pakistan, we have had to live with labelling in Pakistan of being over-friendly. Now, in the last 17 months, actually, the Prime Minister of Pakistan has faced a lot of resentment, criticism from the opposition, from the public, because Kashmir is a very emotive subject in Pakistan. It might be emotive for you, but from Pakistani point of view, internal politics and the foreign ministry cannot, it puts the foreign ministry and the government in a very difficult position when you have situations like the Article 370 and the Citizenship Amendment Act to then talk about recalibrating. So diplomacy has been made very difficult for Pakistan. The way forward, as Mr. Kasuri was saying, was I think even the reservations that India has about the CPEC, the One Belt, One Road, particularly the going through Pakistan. In Pakistan, we have mixed feelings about CPEC also. And in the last year, this past government, we've seen some of the activity on CPEC actually go into cold storage, something which is obviously not liked by some quarters also. I think the way forward would be to focus on things like TAPI, the gas pipeline, because I think breakfast in one city and dinner in another would be only possible if there's breakfast in Delhi and breakfast in Lahore. And right now, our region is energy starved. And this is one of the things which could reset and recalibrate our position also, where India and Pakistan, and I think the US would be very happy to promote this as well. But there have been so many snags with the TAPI gas pipeline. I mean, that's 33 billion cubic meters of gas that we really need. And what better way of connectivity than to give energy to our region?
Well, my question to you actually, Rehan, was going to be about how can a country's politics recalibrate and reset if after 70 years of conflict and tension, the younger generation feels that the politicians are of a certain generation and entrenched in their views. How does it affect the next generation coming up that might be looking to do things differently in a country?
Actually, that's a very important question because, again, I've been running a mentor program for young, for the youth in universities in Pakistan, and I feel that actually things are going perhaps downhill. And the reason is there is a selfie wannabe politician culture now, where you think that you can be snapped with a politician and then rise up to the echelons of power, and it works. That's not the way forward for Pakistani politics. I see that this is much worse than the electables of past years. At least they had some experience. And I'm sure Kasuri Saab and Salman Saab as well will see some of these parliamentarians and those who associate in political parties across the board. It has been a trend set by the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, the PTI, because it was, attracted a lot of youth. But I see that being replicated in other parties as well. It's a sad trend. Genuine leadership, genuine political student workers, genuine party workership, that sort of ethos is completely lost in Pakistan. And I think there is a cult following, again, initiated by PTI, but now being replicated in other parties. And I really must say that every time we see someone raise any point in Parliament or even in press conferences, it's really encouraging. Bilawal Bhutto in recent times, it's been very encouraging to see him speak very clearly and very courageously in Parliament. At least we see someone talk about issues in Parliament. It's sad that we didn't see Maryam Nawaz Sharif get a chance in Parliament. We would have liked to see where she stands with her political views. But I think political representation from constituencies is completely lost in Pakistan. It is, if you know someone, it's a sifarish culture in parties as well. And I've written extensively about this nepotism in the party structure as well. So I think we need to encourage student leadership in universities. We need to encourage a system of candidate selection very similar to the one we have in the UK, where you go through a board where there is limited nepotism, if any. And I think that is what we need. We really need to encourage young leadership. And in recent times in India and Pakistan, we've seen some of the most sensible voices come from women, young women in India and Pakistan, and young people in Pakistan. The Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, the liberal movement in Punjab, the Red movement. I think these are things that need to be encouraged.
So I'll just wrap up with Salman Bashir here on the idea. Can you see a young generation in Pakistan who might go into politics without baggage?
I think so, yes. I think in Pakistan, certainly, because I think for us, generally speaking, the nature of issues is changing. You know, today everybody, even irrespective of his stature or economic situation, is carrying a cell phone, you know, be it a gardener or peasant or, you know, so they are exposed to the world. I think their way of looking at themselves and their place in the country, in the society, and globally is very different from those of previous years. So definitely this generational change is something that is going to be a reality. Hopefully it will be good. Hopefully we will be able to see more clearly the commonalities, the common challenges, be it like the epidemics or the pandemics, or, you know, issues like climate change, of water, of drought, of pollution. These are all issues that need to be brought to the surface also in our internal political discussions. And certainly I think in terms of education and technology, Pakistani society, I see, is changing very fast, and sometimes we get an uneasy feeling because it's different than what it used to be. And I'm sure that's the case everywhere in India and globally. So the septuagenarians, etc., may still be in power in various capitals of the world, but their view of the world and their way of handling it is probably deficient because the challenges, the nature of challenges is different.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. A big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.
has no democracy, it must go through. Therefore, I would reduce the 34 to truly democratic countries. In Sri Lanka, we had this. In 2011, the two-term limit was changed by Parliament. And when the presidential elections were held in 2015, we went on the basis that the changing the two-term limit was wrong and to change the then president. And the electorate went along because that we had a democratic system. So we got President Sirisena in, and immediately Parliament, including those who had voted for the original amendment, had to vote for the 19th amendment, which limited the term of office, limited it 2 terms of office. So if you have a democratic system that is functioning, you can some way or you can oppose it. If your system is not democratic, it is like the referenda that is held in North Korea, 99.9 or 102% vote.
But do you agree there's an erosion, sir, of the democratic process, of the norms?
No, there is, if you look at in some of them or some of the safeguards. But on the other hand, the world has opened up. A lot more transparent. Even in a non-democratic country, you know what is happening outside. Now, the Maldivian minister knows, I know how we use the system and how we've been able to get back to office, and now the system has thrown some of us out of office. But as long as it's protected. So what's happened now, taking the countries that are not democratic, is that the media, the social media, has opened it up. And therefore, this you find that people are forming opinions, and in different ways, the non-democratic states are also being forced to respond to it.
Dr. Freiberger, a Freedom House report from 2018 noted that since 2006, 113 countries saw a net decline in freedom. And the 2018 Democracy Index of the Economic Intelligence Unit also recorded the quote-unquote worst decline in global democracy in years. Why are more and more countries sliding into authoritarian rule, and do you believe that corruption is a factor?
I think the evaluation that you've just referred to indicates a step backwards from a previous movement of increasing democracy across the world. One of the big steps was the fall of communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And that meant that tens of millions of people who had been submitted to an authoritarian system and an authoritarian ideology were freed from this oppression, able to recreate their independence, as the case of Latvia and our neighbors in the Baltic, to have democratic governments and to make a choice in how they are to be governed. There are other parts of the world where the process has gone in the opposite direction. I think that it's very difficult to generalize. The world is exceedingly different in terms of where we start from. For instance, in Africa, a place like the Congo, where a colleague of mine at the Trust Fund for Victims of the International Criminal Court, where we work together with a Congolese lawyer, he reminded us that when the Belgians left the Congo as a colony of the king, there were 3 persons with a university education in the Congo. Obviously, a country so little prepared in terms of the general education of the population is hardly in a position to establish a democracy. So across the world, I would say that the level of literacy, the level of education, the minimal level, the standard of living, those are the preconditions for individuals to be able to participate in any sort of decision-making. And it's a virtuous or a vicious circle, depending on the circumstances. Whether the governance in place prevents the populations from making progress or the other way around.
Let me make it more provocative than David Stewart. Is democracy overrated? Some have said that we do not have the imagination to think of a political system that is other than democracy, and we tend to sell democracy and liberal values as not just the best option, but the only option for countries. But this is not 1930, and tanks will not be out on the streets if we do not have a democratic system.
Well, as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst system of all political systems except for all the others. And that, I think, is true. People who live in countries that are not democratic will understand the importance of democracy. But in a democracy, power by definition is in the hands of the people. And the quality of the democracy will depend very much on the degree of education, the degree of responsibility and commitment that the people have to the success of the democracy. And the sad truth is that electorates can be just as corrupt as any other holder of power. And too often these days, in the West, I think, we have elections which are auctions by parties offering the people more and more for less and less. And the only way that governments can meet those promises is to borrow money. And I think this is at the root of a lot of the problems we have in Western democracies now. We need more responsible, better educated voters to make sure that democracy succeeds.
Indeed. You made a very interesting point, Maria Didi, if I could draw on that. He said that electorates can be corrupt as well, and people who vote can be swayed by very personal and very basic motivations. And then the example of China is often given. China is a country that has seen stunning economic rise in the past couple of decades. Its GDP per capita, for instance, has increased 16 times between 1990 and 2017. It has acted against graft, sometimes politically motivated, but it has acted, the government has. And yet China is an authoritarian capitalist state. It is often said in this region, in South Asia, that the China model is the best model. Let's grow economically and then talk about other elitist values. Do you agree with the idea?
Democracy is hard work. It's not easy. It's very easy for countries and people to say, that authoritarian rule is the best, and if you clamp down hard on dissent, that you're going to get a success in economy or things like this. A lot of people do believe in strong rule as well. But if you want a system that is not corrupt, if you want a system that is answerable to the people, if you want a system that is transparent, good governance, then you need democracy. We have had instances in the past in our country as well, where there's been strong hand rule, where all the opposition leaders have been put in jail. Like the last 5 years, we went for an election without having any opposition leaders. They were all in exile or in jail. But it wasn't good for the country. There were so much borrowing as well, and a lot of things were corrupt. So if you want to have a system where, people are answerable, the leaders are answerable, they act for the people, then you need a system where it's transparent and all that. Nowadays, you see that there's social media, there's media as well, but there is, I believe, to some extent, an erosion in democratic norms. I mean, worldwide, you see that on the media. You know, some of the bigger countries, you see where, as a young democratic activist, you know, I've been involved in constitutional making in Modus, which made the system more transparent, brought in constitutional democracy to the Modus. But those countries that we aspired to, in my 20 years in Parliament, what we see from the media, there's been an erosion in these democratic norms, and we hope that, you know, social media and other media would pick up on that. I mean, social media can be used in a good way, and social media can be used like the Cambridge Analytica or something to really confuse the electorate as well. So, as you say, in our sort of system, there's a need-based voting system as well, where some of the people, they just go to the electorate and offer certain things and then get their votes. But more and more, I think, as the younger generation come up, you know, we are about more than 50% youth in the country. We are seeing people who are more educated, more based on the manifesto and promises that we offer to the people, rather than those things that we offer as sweeteners when we get the votes from them. So I feel, although there's an erosion of democratic norms to some extent worldwide, there is hope. Thank you.
There is hope indeed. And social media and technology in general can be a double-edged sword, as you said. Dr. Freiberger, has technology, or does technology sometimes tend to hijack democratic processes? We've seen elections being hacked using technology. We've seen authoritarian states or powers monitor their people more closely using technology. Has it contributed to somehow weakening the processes? And we're still trying to come to terms and understand how technology can affect our choices.
Technology, like any other tool, can be used for a variety of purposes. It can be a tremendous support to democratic processes by allowing more people to be informed about the alternatives that the party system in democracies offers to, for instance, in elections. But the most modern technologies have also increased the possibility for fake news and fabricated news. Here again, it is not a new invention. Propaganda, lies, inventions, vicious slander are as old as the world. But nowadays, modern technologies give them greater scope and the ability to reach more people. It has become acknowledged that in the future, not just literacy and digital literacy will be necessary for the maintenance of democracies, but real training since childhood to actually distinguish what is likely to be true news, what corresponds to reality, or what has been totally fabricated. Remembering at the same time that any event that you look at can be looked at from different angles. At the time when Egypt was having the so-called Arab Spring, I remember a representative of Al Jazeera saying that when they went with their cameras on Tahrir Square, they had to choose where to direct the cameras. It was a very large crowd, a very large square. And depending on where you focus the cameras, you do get a slight nuance in how you represent the facts. When Pakistan and India look at the same event, each from their own side, it's like people on two sides of a mountain, each having a different picture of it. Absolute truth, as science has been informing us for the last couple of years, absolute truth is an ideal that we strive for. The best we can hope for is an approximation to the truth that will not be harming our neighbors. In other words, the whole point of democracy is to admit that we may be seeing and looking at things from different angles, interpreting them in a somewhat different way, but maintain the ability and the respect to listen to a dissenting view, to listen to a different opinion, to respect their right to express a different opinion, and then to seek for ways of working together and finding the common good. And this is where China, I think, with the Belt and Road Initiative and this emphasis on the win-win strategies in terms of economic development, has really made a breakthrough. And in the previous panel, when people were talking about economic collaboration being possibly the way forward, it might be one of the ways to overcome long-standing differences of opinion and of feeling, which, by the way, in the European Union of today, the history of Europe is one sad sequence of conflicts and wars over the centuries. The 100 Years' War between France and England. 3 major wars between France and Germany before the Monet and Schuman declaration that put together the resources of the Ruhr region and the coal and steel resources of Europe instead of fighting over them. Democracy has been progressing, yes, with the baby steps, if you like, over the centuries. It is by no means perfect now. Elections are by no means a guarantee of a democratic system just because you have elections. Elections can be falsified, manipulated, and so on and so forth. But it is something that respects the right of individuals to have their own opinions. At the same time, the freedom of every individual has to respect the freedom of others. I think Josiah Berlin, the philosopher who was born in Riga and spent his life in Great Britain, in his definitions of liberty emphasized that. My liberty, my ability to have a right to my opinions and my choices ends where that of others begins.
Very well said. Mr. Wickramasinghe, some of the self-appointed torchbearers of democratic values seem to be changing course now, and of liberal values as well. We have democracies like the United States, which are separating migrant children from their parents. Australia is infamous for its indefinite confinement of sea-borne migrants. And when we see these examples, countries like China, for instance, use them as justification for the crackdown on some of their communities, including the Uyghur Muslims. Do you believe that with these recent developments, the line between authoritarianism and democracy is blurring somewhere?
Who are the torchbearers of democracy? Because you declare them to be torchbearers, now you say you now lift up the standards. Australia, in my view, is a democratic country. But it has passed laws responding to its public opinion, which has put certain restrictions on people coming in. So I think that's the right of a country. Now we can't say that this Australia is not democratic because you did not, because they have passed those laws. Many of our countries are forced sometimes to pass laws which due to public response, due to security reasons. So as long as the system is democratic, why are you questioning the law? The best example is during war, when they were locking up people during World War II, they went to courts in UK, and there was the House of Lords case, Liversidge versus Anderson, who was the Secretary of State. They locked up Liversidge, and we have these 2 different sets of judgments, one by the majority, one by the minority, where Lord Atkins said that even in the war, the laws are not silent. And sometimes some of the courts have now used the minority judgment, Lord Atkins. But at that time, they'd lock up people. In USA, they went and locked up a whole lot of innocent Japanese. It didn't mean that they ceased to be democratic. Those are questions that can be examined later by that country to decide whether what they did is right or whether what they did is wrong. So that is one. Secondly, you asked about China and Russia. You know, Nikita Khruschev was not a Democrat at all. He was not liberal, but because of him, the world became a better place. He stopped all the purges of Stalin, of millions and millions of people that Stalin had killed. And then onwards, communism took on a different turn and left to Gorbachev, and Yeltsin, they finished it. Same in China. There was a time of the Cultural Revolution. The president of China was thrown to jail, his clothes were removed. The general secretary's son was thrown out of a building, and became, so many were killed. That doesn't happen in China today. It doesn't mean it's a multi-party state. But, okay, look at it. At the end of the day, now who's the better man, Hitler or Stalin? If Stalin didn't sacrifice 1 million men in Stalingrad, Hitler still would have ruled the world. But Stalin was able to do it because he ran an autocracy, because he had already killed millions of people. But finally, he defeated Hitler. I'm not saying Stalin is good. They were non-democratic, they were brutal. But how do you draw the line? Why do you call a democratic country non-democratic? Because it has to pass certain laws. Here, you all may agree or not agree with the citizenship amendment. I don't want to get into that. But the fact is, your parliament has passed it, and now its validity is being tested. Sorry, let me finish. Its validity is being tested in the Supreme Court. Supreme Court can say it's legal, or it can say it can strike it down, like in USA. So long as the situation works, that's all that I can say. And if I disagree with the Supreme Court, we still have the freedom to go and argue it. The same in Australia.
Right. I also want to bring in the aspect of engaging youth in global governance. And I have numbers again, David Stewart. Young people aged 15 to 35 make up 1/3 of the world's population. But the average age of parliamentarians the world over is 53. Why is youth largely absent from decision-making forums?
We have the same problem in South Africa. We have millions and millions of young people who haven't even registered to vote. This is in a country where the vote was so important to bring liberation. It's a problem of education, and it's a problem of whether kids feel that they are involved in the process. It's a problem of seeing whether this democracy actually helps them in practice. So I think it's a problem that has to be addressed by better education, by doing much more by political parties to involve young people, by recruiting more and more young people as voters, by registering them. But just returning to the other part of the discussion, you know, the critical variable in successful societies is freedom. Because in a free society, where you are free within the limits of the law, you make votes and decisions for yourself and your family every day that affect your life directly. You vote in an election every 5 years or 4 years. There is an absolute correlation between free societies and virtually all the benefits. Free societies have much higher per capita incomes than the least free societies. They have much higher levels of human development. They're even more equal. So the critical thing is about democracy is that it is the best system to protect and defend and advance freedom. And I think this is the problem that the Chinese are also going to experience. They have increased the level of economic freedom in the country, but that creates enormous pressures in any society for greater freedom. And I think this is the crisis that the Chinese will face in the years and decades to come. And I think that's why they're probably so concerned about what's happening in Hong Kong right now. But getting back to the youth, register the kids, educate them, make sure that political parties involve them.
This is what we were talking about when we said we'll offer solutions as well with the questions. Maria Didi, the Finnish Prime Minister, Sanna Marin, is the world's youngest. She is 34 years old, and when she took office, the then Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad, had this to say. He said, "Ask old people for advice." And there was a fair bit of debate on this as well, on why this was being said to her. But I think this is generally the belief that good governance comes with experience. Is that something that you agree with? Do you think we are ready to entrust younger people with taking bigger decisions?
I think it's important to have the youth involved. You see now Greta Thunberg, who is making her voice heard in the climate change issue. We see Malala, who is talking about her hardships and how she wanted younger women to be involved in education. You see a younger participation and encouragement also on the part of the world community to get younger people involved in politics. But you see when they don't participate, the detriment that a country goes to. For instance, I saw on the media and everywhere, when there was Brexit, the older generation voted for Brexit. The younger people wanted them to stay with the EU. But the youth took it for granted that they wouldn't vote Brexit. So their non-participation made the older generation decide for the younger generation in Britain. So I think there are many issues that are involved worldwide, which if the youth thought about it, that they should realize that it's their future, and unless they participate, then there is not going to be a world that is ideal for them to live in, because we move on, generations move on. If the youth participation is not there, then it's difficult. But with social media, you find that we have a very savvy social media, educated young people around. They are always on their texts rather than talking. They'd rather talk through texts. You see them on Twitter, you see them on Instagram, you see them on Facebook. But more and more, I feel youth are disillusioned with politics. So I don't like the thought of ageism in politics, but more and more you find, like in the US, there's Bernie Sanders and there's Trump. You know, there seems to be a lot of aging politicians, but in our country, in the Maldives, you find a very young generation in parliament as well, you know. Most of the parliamentarians in our parliament is between the age of 35 and 45. So I think, you know, when they see the older people making decisions for their country which doesn't reflect their views, then instead of disengaging themselves from politics, the younger generation should become more involved in what is going on. And I think if the political parties have youth movements and things that makes it more conducive for people to participate, especially the younger youth, and have them more involved, it will happen. But worryingly, worldwide, we find that the youth are getting more disengaged with politics and more disillusioned, and they think, you know, stepping back and not being involved in decision making is more fashionable. I see a lot of people when I go canvassing on the streets as well, you know, they say, oh, we are not political. But the thing is, their idea of politics and what really is politics is not about something for some other people. It is us. It is them, it is the youth, it's every baby, you know. So children up to the whatever age and the older generation, everyone gets affected by political decisions. And as long as the youth are also aware, and all the media, including social media and all, make them more aware that every decision that they make, you know, whether it's going to the polls or not, and their decision not to put a vote also would make some sort of decision which would affect them.
You mentioned Greta Thunberg, you mentioned Hong Kong. This has been the theme, the overwhelming theme of 2019 and going into 2020, the protests that we've seen and the young people at the forefront of the protests, even though they may not be participating in the political process, they're making their voices heard on the streets. Do you believe that this protest will continue, and why is it that people feel the need to step out? Do they feel that they are not being heard? Do they feel that they're not being taken as stakeholders? Why do they? What explains this uprising?
I believe that the social media have had a great deal of influence on the various demonstrations that we have been seeing and protests across the world. But the participation of young people in politics and everything else in decision-making is part of the democratic process. If in an aging population it would be more natural to have more aged decision makers, but in many parts of the world where the young people are predominant, one would wish to encourage them to enter into politics and various other positions of responsibility as soon as they're able. We have to remember that young people have as a priority finishing their education, frequently, especially for women, creating a family and having children might be a barrier, and it's encouraging to see countries like New Zealand having a prime minister who is able to have a baby while she is a prime minister. This is something that a few years ago we could not picture. But I remember when I was a young professor and living in Canada and started making public lectures on various topics, people would come up to me and say, frankly, I liked your lecture, but I find that you're too young to be a professor. And they expected a professor to be somebody with a grey beard and obviously a man, not a young woman. And I told them that youth was a disease that time would cure in time. And if you look at me, you can see that this is perfectly true. We, old and young people, are not separate races or separate species of humans. We are all on a sort of sliding sidewalk as time goes by. And the youth of today very soon will turn middle age and then will go into old age. All of us have this drop-off point where actually we disappear from the world. So that we should realize that there's no such thing as the old being one closed category, standing there firm and representing their interests, and the youth being another separate, hermetically separated category. We are all on a sliding sidewalk of time, slowly drifting into our old age and into our common humanity, so that we should remember that young or old, we should have truly as our priority, if we wish to make the world better, to make it better for everybody, young and old, and regardless of any other distinctions.
Mr. Wickramasinghe, one of the issues that young people seem to have taken to with a lot of gusto is climate action. They're demanding climate action the world over. In 2019, there were a total of 409 natural disasters, and there was a lot of human cost, but the world also lost a whopping $232 billion. And yet the people who were at the forefront of this, like Greta Thunberg, they saw a lot of support, but they also saw some leaders discrediting them, calling them children. Are the leaders of the world prepared to sit across the table with young people and take their feedback and work with them?
Well, I would say that climate change concerns are not limited to the young people.
Indeed.
All of us are. It has sort of become an issue which has brought young people out there. But it certainly is a concern for everyone. The question is, how do you handle it? Then you come to the actual politics of it. There are people who will say, like, okay, I will get back to Australia, where they say climate change is the denial of climate change. So there's a big argument going on after the bushfire. So in these democracies, there are different lobbies. For instance, there are the industries who are responsible for the highest level of emissions. They are not willing to be overnight, to be controlled. So there are three different groups. You see that in USA. So it finally has become a battle among interested groups and lobbies in any democracy as to how can you bring in the necessary legislation, necessary rules. But there is a good report, I think, when Ban Ki-moon was General Secretary of the UN, he appointed a committee, if I'm not wrong, headed by Kofi Annan, and containing climate change. That's a very good book, that report that's out there. What we can do. It's very, very practical. You can't stop everything. But the question is then leadership, going into the parliament, getting the laws enacted, that's the biggest struggle. Then finding the machinery that is capable of implementing it. Getting a law enacted is insufficient. Have you the machinery to implement it? Have you got a judiciary that can dispose of the case within a few months instead of taking 2 decades? So all those issues have to be sorted out.
Right. Since this is a very broad subject, global thinkers and ideas, I'll try to cover as much ground as possible. David Stewart, a lot of people from the continent of Africa are trying to make a living in South Africa. And this has given rise not just to competition, but also some tensions, and there's been violence because it stretches the resources. Do you believe that illegal migration is one of the biggest challenges facing South Africa in particular and the world in general?
No, not necessarily. Strangely enough, nobody has the vaguest idea of how many illegal migrants there are in South Africa. You have estimates between 500,000 and 5 million. But the fact is that they're all contributing to the economy. They're all making a really valuable contribution. They're creating jobs. So it hasn't actually caused a lot of visible problems in the economy. Where it is problematic is that we have a very high level of unemployment among our own people. And of course, people who are unemployed will always resent foreigners, particularly illegal foreigners, who've got jobs. And that has been the source of xenophobia in South Africa. But very often this has been exploited by criminal elements. So it's a complex situation. We have very porous borders. We have a really multicultural population in my city, Cape Town, with people who've come all the way from Somalia, all the way from the Congo to get jobs in the city. It actually makes it a very exciting, multicultural, vibrant community, but it also brings tensions.
It does. Maria Didi, the Maldives has contributed, according to one report, the highest number of foreign fighters per capita in Syria. Last month, 3 foreigners were also stabbed. How is the Maldives checking the threat of rising Islamic radicalism?
Radicalism anywhere is not good. We've seen, like, we were talking about radicalization in Maldives for a long time, but suddenly our neighbor Sri Lanka had the Easter Day bombings. Again, in New Zealand, where you would have thought, it's one of the most peaceful countries in the world, we saw a lone wolf, a gunman come and shoot many Muslims as well. So radicalism by itself is no good. If you put it as a percentage, because we are only about 345,000, 400,000 people in Maldives. It sounds a lot, but the exact number of people who've gone as foreign fighters to Syria is not something that we can really put a figure on, because in Maldives it's illegal to go and fight in another country. So they go, and when they do go, we do not have the exact figures. Some estimate it very high, the others, but as per the NCTC, which is the National Counterterrorism Center, we have about 69 foreign fighters with women and children out there in Syria. But the problem is something that needs more thought, because we are talking about an ideal. You know, we are talking about countering sort of thought that gives people an incentive to go and fight in some other country or fight for something that they are made to believe in. So the only way to counter that is to talk about ideals, about peaceful coexistence in society and things like this. And this is something that we are trying very hard in the Maldives from the beginning to counter the radicalization factors that are there, who've studied in other countries. Actually, in the 1980s and before that, when we were younger, we didn't have this problem in the Maldives. The Maldives is one of the most peaceful places on earth that you could have. Our government, since we were sworn in, have acknowledged that we have a problem. We are trying very hard to counter that by getting more moderate views being espoused, what we believe Islam stands for. But our country is a lot of islands, 187 islands in total, with people dispersed all over. So it's a lot of work, but we are getting there. The first positive thing that we have done in the Maldives is to acknowledge that we have a problem there. The second thing is we are identifying those people who are espousing radical views in the country and tackling them on what they are doing, and the acknowledgement of the problem and the tackling of the issues, and then getting people who have more moderate views to go and speak to these people, try to make them understand that we have to coexist in society and live together as very peaceful people.
Dr. Freiberger, Latvia recently signed a joint declaration on 5G security with the United States. Latvia's a joint declaration on 5G security with the US. 5G technology?
Oh, I see.
Yeah. And the text of the declaration does not mention Huawei or any country. But what it says is very interesting. Let me quote from the declaration. It says, whether the network hardware and software suppliers are subject, without independent judicial review, to control by a foreign government. This is something that the supplier should take into account. Basically, it is being seen as a reference to the Chinese company Huawei. The question I want to ask you is that do you find yourself caught between the US-China trade war?
We are a small country who do most of our trade relations with the rest of the European Union. Our trade with the United States is insignificant, and the same could be said with China. We're hardly a world power whose trade position would make a difference here. So that as far as I personally am concerned, I could either say a pox on both their houses or rather wish them well in settling their differences.
Right. Mr. Vikramasinghe, the biggest diplomatic challenge it is said for Sri Lanka at the moment is balancing or striking a balance between India and China. Is that the right assessment, sir, according to you?
No, I would say that is not too much of an issue. We have been friendly with China, and from the time the People's Republic was established, recognized them. We were the first to sign a trade agreement, which brought sanctions from US, and we've had this relationship. How can we balance with India? India and we have the same heritage. We have Buddhism, we have Hinduism, Sanskrit and Pali. All we do as a government to ensure whatever we do will not in any way be a threat to the security of India, and what India does will not be a security for us. Other than that, formally both governments can stop trade between the two countries, but the unofficial underground trade that goes on between Sri Lanka and Chennai can't be stopped. It will still carry on. So what's the use? You are talking of fishermen. Those fishermen now live in both sides. Some of our fishermen have wife in Sri Lanka and another one on the other side. So this is so that's all. With China, we are going ahead. We have, but we have no military alliances with anyone, and we are open with all. So when you say balance, no, you're not balancing. One, we are friends. Other, we are all part of a common heritage.
Spoken like a politician,
we are the Rama and the belt.
The rise of the right has been talked about a lot. And there's an interesting theory that some political experts have put forth. They say that this is not really so much about the support for the right ideology as a protest against the present political establishment.
There's a lot of truth in this. I think that in the European Union, also in the United States, among a section of the population, there is a disaffection with the political class, with bureaucrats who are perceived to have been in power for generations. It doesn't make very much difference whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats or the Tories or Labour. They are the people who call the shots. And a lot of people feel marginalized by this. They feel that they're not being listened to. And I think this is the segment of the population that supports Donald Trump in the United States. It's led to some really negative responses to breakdown of agencies in Washington which have been doing great work on the environment. It's led to a kind of an anti-intellectual, anti-elite approach. So it is a phenomenon. It is dangerous. I think we're seeing it also, of course, in some European countries in response to perceptions regarding to immigration. Undoubtedly, we're facing new realities, new tensions in Western democracies as a result of this.
Before we wrap, I want to quickly ask each one of you, what is the one big idea that you think is going to definitively shape the coming decades? Let's start with you. One big idea that you believe will definitively shape the coming decades, one big concept or trend.
I believe it's social media. The young are very savvy with social media. If we want to attract more younger people to participate in democracy, then we have to use social media. But social media itself can be very dangerous as well. In some ways, it is spreading certain radical ideas to the people and things like this. So if used in a good way, the social media can be an influential factor in giving us what we want. Makes our life as politicians quite difficult as well, because you know, wherever you are, you can be snapped or whatever. But then again, it's good for transparency, it's good for good governance, it's good that every telephone has a camera, and every smartphone, you know, whatever age you are in, Facebook, Twitter, people are very savvy. So one sort of revolution that's taking place, and which I believe would get more younger people involved in democracy and decision making, would be social media social media.
Right. Dr. Freiberger.
There are going to be a great many concerns that will have to be addressed and solved in the years to come. But an important one, in my eyes, is going to be the question of singularity. In other words, what is the uniqueness of being human as opposed to an algorithm or an application or a program in artificial intelligence? When people are going to go through social media to look for a life partner and fall in love with somebody's picture and CV, that seems the answer to their dreams, and then they discover that it's either a 10-year-old child or somebody who's 80 years old and who's pretending to be, say, a young man in search of a wife. This is going to be one of the practical problems of distinguishing false personalities from real personalities. But essentially, as increasingly electronic, mechanical things are going to replace human beings in terms of their agency and their actions. We will have driverless cars, eventually pilotless planes, factories where at most, already I think in Japan, the car-making factories are all under robots, and the only humans are the ones who clean the floors. Eventually, of course, by now, there must be robots who clean the floors as well. What are humans going to do? And how are we going to be able to preserve the characteristics that distinguish humans from simulacra, from imitations of humanity that we're going to be able to produce artificially? I think it's going to be a difficult problem, and this is where we will need our poets and our artists to remind us of what truly is the essence of being human and what it is that we have to concern ourselves with to preserve our humanity and not to lose it.
The idea or the concept that you think is going to shape the coming decades?
I wish I knew. All I can say is the mind. Human mind has made so many innovations and made so many challenges, because finally, as a follower of the Buddha, I believe you are what your mind can make you. So if we can really be in a position where our minds are such that we can meet up the challenges, we go for a better world. If not, we'll have chaos.
I think it will be fundamental, accelerating an unpredictable change. In a city like this, which 60 years ago was a sleepy fishing village, now this huge world city with the tallest buildings in the world and traffic, it's an example of how rapidly the world is changing, technologically, demographically, in terms of strategic relationships. And all of this is leaving us and leaving individuals with a huge, huge problem, and that is meaning. I think we came together in small societies 40,000 years ago for meaning. And I'm not sure that our wonderful mega civilization is generating meaning any longer. And I think that is the problem.
Very well said. Thank you so much. I think you've all given us a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much for sharing your ideas with us. Thank you.
Platinum partner, TVS and Torque. Knowledge partner, Amity University, Dubai. State partner, Uttar Pradesh Sarkar. Travel partner, Air India. Hospitality partner, The Oberoi, Dubai. State partner, Madhya Pradesh Shasan. Silver partner, General Insurance Council. Silver partner, Godrej Expert Rich Cream. Print partner, UAE Khalij Times. Print partner, India, The Hindu.
Loud and clear.